Washington's got plenty of playmakers.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hansen. He's the site editor with Lathan Sports' Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Lars, we've got a really fun show coming at all the everydayers. We're going to get there in just one sec, because just a quick reminder, right here on YouTube, wherever you're getting this, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, anything like that, make sure you hit that subscribe, that follow button, as we're going to be at each and every single spring practice that we're able to be at, because there is a walkthrough in there as well. And yeah, we're just going to have so much fun stuff on all forms of social media. So make sure you go check us out wherever you are on social media, because you're going to see so much fun stuff. And Lars, that starts right now, because we got to talk about Washington's latest basketball commit in the transfer portal. That's center Lathan Sommerville from Rutgers. Might even throw some McDonald's All-American talk in there as well. Talk about recruiting, because five-star tackle Kodi Greene is going to be on campus. Washington's getting a visit from four-star quarterback. That's a really interesting scenario. But we're going to talk about Washington's biggest playmakers. And we said, hey, we got to throw out all the top guys, right? The Denzel Bostons, the Jonah Colemans of the world. We know they're going to be right there in the mix. So who's the first guy you wanted to go with?
Kind of a guy that has been talked about a lot, and we even talked about it, I think, on yesterday's show. It's Anterio Thompson, a guy that, you know, when you look at the interior of the D-line, there's Simone Peppa, Logan Sagapolu types, and then there's the Anterio Thompson type, where you're not necessarily, and that's no slight at either of those guys, because you do need some girth, some Alberto beef, if you will, in the middle of that line, but you also need a little bit more of a disruptor, and that's, I think, what Anterio Thompson's going to be. And so when you think about whether you have 3, 4, 5 down linemen, however many it may be, Anterio seems like a guy where, again, first day of practice, you're not really going to be able to say, hey, man, he's going to have 6+ sacks and really be a guy. But I just think the way that he's fitting in, the way that Jedd Fisch is talking about him, usually coaches don't go out of their way to talk about guys that, haven't even really been around the program that much. He's not going all in on Omari Evans and hey, Omari is good. That was the reason why. Whereas when you hear him talk about Anterio, it's he's gotten a lot bigger, he's gotten a lot stronger, and I think that's exactly what Jedd wanted to do in the trenches. And so when you think about a playmaker, it might not be the first guy that comes to mind, but I think a guy that might make several plays where you're like, oh wow, that's not the traditional playmaker, but man, he's really making an impact this fall.
No, I like this, because I wanted to talk about one of the guys who's right next to him, who you and I were talking about before the show, and that's Uiagaleilei, where it's one of those things where, we've talked a lot about what Ryan Walter's scheme is going to look like in terms of creating advantageous matchups for some of these defensive linemen, and he looks like one of the guys that's going to take the most advantage of that, and I'm curious to see what this is going to look like this spring, where we saw what the numbers were at Arizona. It's 45 pressures over the last 2 years, and it translated into a little bit of production in terms of sacks there. And I think he might have an opportunity to improve on that this year, where when we talked to Jedd on Tuesday, it was, it's not just the 4-eye and the 5 that Ryan Walters was talking about. It's the 3, it's the 6. It's a lining up against tight end, where it is a little bit of just truly everywhere on the defensive line, which is really nice to see. And not only in terms of having a piece like that can move all over the line, it's somebody who has shown that he can be productive in all of those different spots. And when, you think about it, it's, hey, if Zach Durfee's healthy, you hope that he can be the team leader in sacks, right? You hope Isaiah Ward can take a step forward. Russell Davis can pick up where he left off before he got hurt. And you see all that and you say, okay, that's really nice. But what we haven't seen Washington really have in a while is guys that can really get after it from the interior. And, whether it's just disrupt and force bad throws and blow up run plays every once in a while, or guys that can actually get sacks, that's something we haven't seen at Washington in feels like 6 or 7 years at this point, whenever Vita Vea was last around.
Well, I was going to say, aside from Vita, because Vita is I'm not saying it's the easy name to throw out, but in a way, a former one-time Philadelphia Eagle had a cup of coffee, Elijah Qualls. That's a guy that, now again, a slightly different size. I think Ty's a little bit taller. Elijah was, I think, around 300, I want to say roughly, maybe give or take, but both similar styles where it's, you can kind of, they don't really have a position. It's just D lineman, lineman. We'll figure out where, and then it's kind of crazy that we say this, because I forgot this. I'm not saying I truly forgot, but like I think Deshaun Lynch kind of gets lost in this mix. And so the reason why I mentioned him as well, but when you think about the versatility that Ryan Walters, I think that's kind of right. It's kind of why Ryan Walters pushed back a little bit Monday when I was like, hey, like, your scheme. It's like, look, it's not just the 5-1-5. Obviously, like if you go on a base situation, that kind of could be what you call it. But because of those 5, you could have 3, 4, or 5, and it depends on, do you have just one Isaiah Ward like you mentioned, or do you have Zach and Isaiah on the other side? And it just all kind of works together where there's so much potential for this defense. Ryan Walters kind of almost like a kid at the candy store where it's like, oh wow, there's so many choices. Like, how do I figure this out? That's a good problem to have versus, all right, well, we got Logan and Simone.
Right. No, that's a really good point because it's something you and I talked about where Bryce Butler is a name I want to throw out there as well, where we saw him do just really well in terms of shooting gaps at different points last season. And it's having that depth that you didn't last year is so important. But I want to jump over to the offensive side because one guy that we talked about a little bit yesterday that I just need to spend a minute on is Justice Williams, where I look at this young group of receivers. I was writing something about Omari Evans for Huskies Wire, and I went back and listened to Jedd's full comments about him where he wasn't one of the names that he brought up where it was, oh yeah, along with Denzel and Omari, we've got Audric, we've got Kevin Greene, we got Rashid Williams, we got all these other young guys. So we kind of got lumped into that bucket a little bit. But it's everything I said about him yesterday, where it's looking at the size, the movement, the physicality that he brings. I love all of that, but then I just love what this offense can do for him, just really on the outside, because there is going to be an opportunity for him to step up and establish himself on the depth chart this spring among all the other inexperienced receivers, where it's something like, I did the math a little bit earlier. It's 21 catches for 265 yards at the college level from all players that are not Denzel Boston and Omari Evans at wide receiver. So he's going to have an opportunity to prove himself at the position. And I look at Audric Harris, I look at Kevin Greene, and I say, yeah, those guys are certainly very promising players. I think that they like him a little bit more in the slot. And Justice is the kind of guy who can step up. And, maybe it's similar to what Rashid Williams did last year, right? Where it's 13 catches for 170 yards, something in that vein. And you say, oh, okay, yeah, that's not necessarily eye-popping numbers, but that's something where I look down the line and I say, it seems like he really is a big part of their plans on the outside.
Yeah, I would say like the goal for Justice this season should be lay your foundation. Where last year was kind of like, just because I love using that buzzword that Jedd loves using, but last year was kind of like the prologue where it's, look, come in, just get used to college, just be a student at the first part of your career. Now it's about, okay, cool. Now you're fully healthy. You don't have to worry about rehab because that was the initial problem. Like he came here and he wasn't ready to go. Not physically in terms of like couldn't play it, but it just was hurt. And so I think there shouldn't be like such a high expectation. I'm not saying you're setting one, but just as like in 2 years, if he ends up being what Denzel was last year, that's kind of the goal. Maybe now if you can cut that into 1 year, unless we see a significant change. Even though Jedd throws out Jacob Cowing and a few others, really it's like a 2-receiver offense. You seem to have the bulk of guys having 2, and then there's a third option, whether it's Kevin Greene, Decker, whoever. If Jedd can find a way to maybe bump each of those up, call it a dozen, that could be where Rashid's dozen came in last year, where Justice is coming in this season. I would say probably like between like 10, 20. That would be the goal, a couple hundred yards, at least a touchdown or 2, just so you can say like, cool, this is where your strengths are. We can spell you and use you where Denzel is, or use you where Omari is as a disguise and things like that. Just get him into a position where you're going into 2026 and saying, okay, now Justice can actually be counted on as one of the guys along with Audric and a few others.
No, I like where you're going with that a lot. And Lars, I also like where this staff is going on the recruiting trail because there's going to be a 5-star tackle on campus in a few weeks. And we'll get there right after a message from our friends over at 5 Hour Energy. Daylight savings snuck up on us again. And if you're feeling that lost hour of sleep, 5 Hour Energy has your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, but sometimes you need a little boost to power through. Whether you're staying up late watching the NCAA tournament, squeezing in a round of golf after work, or just trying to keep up with your busy day, 5 Hour Energy gives you that quick, refreshing pick-me-up whenever you need it. With longer days, I love getting outside for a hike or a run, and Tropical Burst is my go-to for a quick boost. Head to 5hourenergy.com to find over 15 flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, and peach mango. You can even build your own 12-pack or 24-pack delivered right to your door. Need one now? Grab a 5 Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. They're everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized. So, Lars, a really interesting note where I'm sure we're going to dive into this conversation. Right now, Kodi Greene, a former product of Eastside Catholic who transferred down to Mater Dei in Southern California, is committed to Oregon, but he's got some visits lined up. According to On3, he's going to Texas, he's going to USC, and he's coming to Washington. I believe Chad Simmons said April 18th is the date he's supposed to be on campus. And I'm really curious to see what this is going to look like, because you and I had a conversation about Kenny Pepe a few weeks ago saying, hey, it looks like they're a dark horse contender. Obviously, that didn't end up coming to fruition. They didn't make the top 5, so it doesn't look like he'll be on campus at any point soon. But for somebody who is from the state of Washington, probably has a good relationship with a lot of these coaches already, especially, some of these local guys. I'm very, very intrigued by this situation.
And his younger brother is still on the team. If you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think because he did, Kodi Greene did put his name in the portal, but has sent, I think it was almost not immediately after, but like a week or so after came back and has been at practice. So I think, and again, you don't take a kid just to take his younger brother. You don't take Lowen to take Derek. As we found out, like Lowen's taking snaps at center. So like you clearly want to take guys to make sure they have a role. But that was also part where it's like, hey, wow, he commits to Oregon, but he has his brother up here. And it's like, why not, why would you not want to play for his brother? And I think time is the best factor for Washington in the sense where you still have plenty of time to go until December when he signs. As long as you can stay in that conversation, once players see this, the offense is falling, it's, hey, wow, maybe I could actually be the next left tackle instead of Kenny Pepe. I could, be that next guy over there when Max graduates and things like that, and Carver graduates, whoever ends up being left tackle. We talked about that on yesterday's show. Go check it out. But you look at Kodi Greene, and it's, man, anytime you can bring a state talent back, you kind of have to do it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of those things where, obviously if he's still around, it's one of those things where if he does up into Washington, it's the win you didn't get with Josh Connerly, right? But now I think it is going to have a little bit, like, let's say down the line, he does sign with Washington. Let's sit with that hypothetical for a second. And he does, it's all of a sudden, hey, Washington grabbed a 5-star tackle from California. Because that's one of the ridiculous things about recruiting services. This is just my way to get to a quick rant here, where it's, oh, wow, they signed one of the best tackles in the nation, one of the best players in California. And it's, yeah, he's originally from up here, but there's no way a lot of these people who don't necessarily dive into the West Coast as much as they should are going to see that. But it's nonetheless, it would be a huge win for the staff, where with that push for Kenny Pepe, it was very obvious, hey, we want to find a way to get one of the best offensive linemen in the country in this class. They're still pushing for some really high-end talents, right? You and I really like what Aaron Thomas and Dominic Harris bring to the table as 3 stars. Sam Utu is another really intriguing prospect, high-end 4-star, like right there bordering on a top 100 guy. But Kodi Greene is just such an impressive prospect. And it's one of those things where, shout out to Michael Switzer for finding a way to stay in this race, and to some of the guys on the off-field staff as well, I'm sure, where I look at all that and I say, I like Washington's chances here, because I also look at it as whatever's going on at Oregon, there has been an exodus there recently. We've seen a bunch of their defensive linemen decommit. We've seen a whole bunch of players go elsewhere for one reason or another. We have to throw that in there, right? But I kind of like where Washington is sitting at this point in time.
I mean, it's almost like good karma for all the offensive guys. Like the guy, Foster Sorrell, it was another name that came down and went to Stanford, where obviously it's not Oregon, but you just look and say, like, there's so many guys who could have been that next left tackle at Washington, where Trey Adams kind of was that guy, but it's almost like, from Wenatchee, not that the East Side doesn't matter, but if you can get somebody from East Side Catholic, especially when you're looking at what's coming down the pipe at EDC and a few other guys in state, it's like, if that can start being, going back to being a well for Washington, because you had almost every year you had a guy coming from Eastside Catholic going to Washington, whereas whether it's, Sam Adams originally, or you go all the way back to Brandon Wellington, there's a number of guys that you can look at and say Eastside Catholic, formerly Bellevue at one point, when you had players coming out of Bellevue. There's always some school on the west side of Washington where it's like, hey, you kind of got to stay in tune with that school. And in a way, also, it kind of, brings everything full circle because also what we talked about with CJ Lavender, which was the modern day connection. You got Dash Beerley, you got Marcus Harris, you got a number of guys, Sean Scott, a guy who could potentially pick to Washington or, end up at Washington, those sorts of things. And so anytime, again, if you can establish a modern day pipeline, USC can't get everybody. Texas can't get everybody. And we saw that last year with John Mills, where it's, hey, John Mills, do you want to come back? Texas is overloaded, or you just want to come back, or whatever the case may be. Just stay in the conversation. Those relationships are going to be there. And I think the fact that, like you said, they're going to take a bona fide, top 5, top 3 left tackle or offensive tackle in this class. I think that's a good sell because it's like, hey, if Jedd's saying, hey, these are my 3 offensive tackles that I want in this class, we can only take one, or obviously they would take off.
I don't even. But Right. It's not necessarily I think they certainly are making that push, which is something we saw last year, right? Especially at wide receiver, and it didn't pay off. Where what is going to be different with that approach this year? Is it going to be an NIL thing? Is it going to be hey, look at what you can do, where we have Carver Willis there right now, and we have a whole bunch of guys that we really like, but we're going to give you an opportunity to come in and win the job from day one, which I think that there's a lot there that's worth exploring. But Lars, there's also a whole lot worth exploring with Derek Zammit, where a 4-star quarterback from New Jersey. I remember when he dropped his top 4, I looked at my phone and I said, oh, I wasn't really expecting that one. And it has nothing to do with the player. He's a really talented player who fits the system really well. He's very mobile. He throws on the run. He looks a lot. I don't want to say he looks like Damon because Damon's film is certainly unique in that regard, but he has a very similar play style where he tucks and runs and he's good at it. And he's very, very accurate when he's throwing on the run. So I'm really intrigued by that. He's supposed to be visiting. I believe it's either this weekend or next weekend. And it's one of those things where we got a couple of questions about it. And it's, hey, what does this mean for Brady Smigiel?
I mean, again, it's on a certain level, as Brady continues to take some of his other visits that he's got lined up between now and call it June 19th. If you're Washington, you kind of got to do your due diligence. You kind of got to make sure you're spanning the net. And at the same point, Washington has been offering a number of guys from the state of New Jersey. So why not? If a quarterback is high on you, say, sure, you know what? We don't have a quarterback yet in this class. Obviously, if you want Brady Smigiel, you'll hold out for him a little bit. But I don't think this is necessarily a true case of Jake Browning, Brett Rippon. But it's worth remembering. It's like, hey, like Jake kind of had to snipe Brett in order to get that spot at Washington because otherwise Brett was going to take it. I don't think there's a situation in which Derek would come in and say, hey, I'm going to, commit this coming weekend and just call it a wrap. Because I do think ultimately Washington, if you could only have one, I'm not going to make the other analogy where, I think they would take Brady Smigiel, but then, and it's no slight to Derek, but at the same point, given, the Cal, it's like, if you were to go away from the Cali wave, I don't think it's a concern for Washington. I think it's it's another selling point, kind of something I asked Jimmy Doherty, which is, like being a quarterback in this system, like how attractive is it as knowing you got to recruit guys every year and you're looking at, sophomores, seniors, freshmen, like how would another quarterback want to join that mix as a young guy in this day and age? And it's you get the development, you get the verbiage. So it's showing, hey, no matter where you are in the country, whether in New Jersey or California, we attract the best quarterbacks in the country. Now, the question is, would Derek end up at Washington? Maybe, maybe not. But it's not the worst thing to be in the top 4. And if you don't make it and you still get Brady, cool. It just shows that your program has range and reach.
So that's one of the things I'm really intrigued by with this, where he has been on quite a visit tour over the last week. Not Brady, Derek Zammit, that is, where he went to Alabama, who he also has in his top 4. Apparently, he went to Ohio State the other day. And, it's supposed to be coming to Washington this weekend. So he's somebody who certainly is seeing his stock rise, which is nice because it plays into something you and I have talked about when it comes to the quarterback position. It's Jedd and Jimmy Doherty and this staff are very good at identifying talent in that regard. So that's, it's nice to see that. And it's nice to know that where, again, as you said, it shouldn't necessarily have that much of an impact on Brady Smigiel, but there's a certain point where you might sit there and you say, okay, we know the crystal balls are in place from all those guys saying, okay, yeah, from Steve Wiltfong, from Chad Simmons, from whoever else saying, yeah, we believe he's going to end up at Washington because, as I said the last time we talked about this, those don't come out of nowhere. You're usually hearing something when you put one of those in because they are public. People will see all that information. So I think there's a non-zero chance that it's one of those things where you're inviting Derek on a visit to say, yeah, we do really like you and we want to keep this line open. We want to make sure that there's a relationship here. But at the same point, Brady is the number one target on our board at this position right now. It looks like both guys would fit in the offense. Both guys are certainly very, very talented. But right now, the plan is to take Brady because he's the West Coast guy. But there's a certain point of, we know what Brady has said about wanting to build a strong class around him. And it's something where we've seen that with Landon Miri on social media, where it seems like those two have developed a really strong relationship. And certainly with Landon pushing his official visit back to be here the same weekend that Brady is, there's a lot in the tea leaves that just kind of point to, yeah, they're not certainly pushing Brady off by any sense. And it just feels like they want to get him in the boat sooner rather than later to continue to build the class.
And in a way, this is also kind of puts a little pressure on Brady. Like, oh, wait, they're considering another quarterback. It's like, the girl you're courting, and it's like, hey, if you don't put a ring on it, man, eventually at some point she's going to start looking again. Like, you kind of got to make sure you keep it locked down. But you can allow, Brady to take you a visit to South Carolina and Michigan, and there's a couple of those. But I think at some point Brady's going to get, I would, again, just in my opinion, I would assume Brady kind of says, all right, you know what, they're looking, all right, let's okay, we know what we want, cool, let's make the decision. And then, which again is why I said it'll likely come before June 19th, just because I think at some point push is going to have to come to shove, where if Brady's uncommitted all the way up until even the beginning of June, then the conversation of Derek and a few others, it's like, oh, okay, well, is this more real than we thought?
Right, and that's something to keep an eye on, because I think Derek does want to commit at some point this month. So there's a lot of moving parts there, and it should straighten itself up pretty quickly, in my opinion. But Lars, we got to switch gears here and talk some basketball, which we'll get to right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. The NCAA tournament is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something exciting to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use. When I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around, which is good news for me, because throughout this entire process, I've had a Florida Duke final with Florida winning it all. So like where that's going, I'm going to be certainly keeping an eye on just all those numbers over on FanDuel, and you can too. Just visit FanDuel.com and get on the college hoops actions all tournament long.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
So Lars, before we dive into some of this transfer portal action, quick shout out to Niko Bundalo and Brynn McGaughy at the McDonald's All-American games at the Barclays Center. They both showed out. Niko Bundalo had 12.6 rebounds, and Brynn McGaughy led all scorers in the women's game with 17 points and 7 rebounds. Probably should have won MVP, in my opinion. Real nice to see that, and just it's nice to see that the future of both the men's and women's team. I think that's really cool. But we can't even get to the future, because right now Washington doesn't have a full roster, and we saw them get their first commit yesterday on Tuesday. We record this on Wednesday in Lathan Sommerville, the Rutgers center. And I think this is a really solid addition, because he's not somebody who necessarily needs to come in and start, but he can be a really solid bench option with Big Ten experience, which is exactly what you're looking for.
And a guy who's young, whereas you're not just getting a 1 year. Well, again, I'm sure I know, right as I said, that someone's going to come into the comments, well, every year in college basketball, they're a 1 year rental. Okay, fine. Sure. In that regard, sure, everybody is a 1 year rental. But in that case, so would Danny Sprinkle, because every year coach is going to leave too. But with that being said, I think Danny looked at it and said, okay, this is a guy who's got 6'10", what you said, I think 275. I've seen 260 to 275. Either way, whatever you're talking about in that range, good enough. And I think obviously you're not expecting him to push Frank, but knowing that Frank, hasn't been able to stay healthy for a full year. Sommerville started 15 games at Rutgers this past season. So you're thinking of a guy that's young and kind of ascending. I'm not saying the great off-the-board track, but where we saw great as a freshman play, I think all those games, I think he started maybe 12 to 15, and then the next year was like 25, and then he really took off as a junior and senior. And you look at that and say, okay, Danny knows the progression of a front court and what he wants to see. This is him saying, okay, now I've been able to get in early. Now I can start the portal process and get going and get guys that I really feel like can fit my system. And so I think in that regard, this is a good short and long-term addition for Washington.
And that's one of the biggest things where, it's something Danny said at some point a couple months ago in one of his press conferences where he was talking about the portal process that he had to go through after he got here and had to build his staff, and said, yeah, there weren't a lot of players that I felt might have been Big Ten players available in the transfer portal. And that's one of the things that you don't necessarily have to deal with this year. And, it's going to sound like an excuse from his end, but it is a realistic thing when you're building a staff and having to build an entire roster after getting hired a little bit later on in the cycle. It's a real thing to think about. So I look at this and I say, having a backup 5 where, he could probably play the 4 as well and play next to Frank, maybe with Frank's ability to just be as hyper athletic and just intense as he is. We saw him go out and guard on the perimeter. I don't think that's something that we'll see Lathan Sommerville do very often, but having a guy like that who started 15 games this past season can come off the bench and shoot free throws, by the way, which is just always wonderful to see, over 86% at the line. That's a really nice addition. When you still have Matty Traore in the mix, you have Niko Bundalo in the mix, which is why I wanted to start off with Niko. And those are all really important additions as you continue to look at build this, because we saw Wilhelm Breidenbach enter the transfer portal. That shocked me, by the way. I thought he was out of eligibility, but it looks like he might have a medical redshirt year available from his first season. But it's one of those things where we saw Wilhelm have to take on a lot of responsibilities after Frank went down, because Danny wasn't comfortable with KC Ibekwe for long stretches of time. And then the only other big you have on the floor is Great Osibor. He was the only other big you really had available because Chris Conway was hurt as well. So seeing Lathan come in, it's nice because I don't think it's necessarily something that's going to be a major needle mover, right? Where you look at the 247 transfer rankings. It's not something where people are going to say, oh yeah, this is the addition they needed. No, but Danny has talked about building depth, and that's exactly what you're doing with this. You're grabbing a guy who can start when you need him to, but also come off the bench and contribute and be a big physical presence in the Big Ten. And by the way, like we said, he's got that experience too, which is so important.
Yeah, and I think it allows, because you don't want to lean on one guy too much, where this season everything kind of hinged on Frank. If Frank is healthy, then Great can do his thing. If Great has to be the only one holding it down to the 5, you're in trouble. Just because Great was going to get abused, and that's exactly what happened. And so you look at it, like you mentioned, when you listen to Matty Traore, it's like, Danny Sprinkle was talking him up a lot, and so one might think, oh, well, you already have him coming in plus Frank. Now you're adding this guy. Like, how are you going to sort all that out?
Not enough.
But then, first of all, it's still not enough. But it's a good problem to have. Like if you're trying to figure out in which matchups, like we saw in the Big Ten this season, where sometimes you don't have, you kind of need to have a smaller lineup on the court. Figure that out as you go. But the point being that it allows you to kind of be versatile and flexible. And also make sure if you want to develop Sommerville and have Matty Traore take maybe the more brunt of it early because he's got more experience, you just look at that and say, either way they can feed off of each other. And then it still doesn't preclude Frank from coming back to say, hey, like I want to finish what I started, this and that. It gives you so many options in the front court where, again, like you said this season, they just did not have any.
No, absolutely. And it's something where, as we come up on a dead period, as the Everydayers are listening to this on Thursday, the question turns to who's next. Because you still need to add a whole bunch in the backcourt after Makai Mason, Tyler Harris into the transfer portal. You really are just building a full new roster again, which is unfortunate, but also just part of college basketball. Is there any names that's sticking out to you and saying, like, yeah, this is one guy who I think might be the next commit, or is just a name to keep an eye on?
I mean, Kennard Davis is the one to me where if you can find a way to that's what's intriguing to me is the fact that you have a front court addition before you have a backcourt addition. Because you look at it, you have JJ Maniquit, all those guys coming, Cortland Waldry coming in the class, in the high school class. But aside from Zoom, it's like I'm really curious to see what Danny ends up doing in the backcourt because there's so many options that they've clearly been expressed interest in. But then it's a matter of, okay, well, express interest versus, hey, is it an actual fit versus then get you up for a visit and everything checks out. Because one thing we do know about Danny is he will be meticulous in terms of vetting his guys and the guys that he does bring in because, I mean, we saw this past season where we don't know what specifically the case was, but with, Luis, where that was the guy he brought in the portal and then said, hey, you know what, got to suspend you and this and that. And so it's making sure that everybody that comes into the program checks the box and allows him to continue building. Because if you're going to gut the roster again, You can't bring in players that aren't going to work again, because you can get the excuse the first year of, hey, like, I didn't have my guys. This is why I need to rework some things. If you do that for a second consecutive portal, knowing how frequent Danny is with having to build through the portal at Montana State and Utah State, you look at it and say, okay, now, like, I think this is why it's actually good for Danny to take a longer time vetting some guys and not just throwing bags for the sake of, hey, we need guys, we need this and that. Don't overpay. Pay for the right guys.
No, it's exactly that. I like the way you put that, because one name that I wanted to throw out before we get out of here is Nick Boyd from San Diego State, where it's one of those ones where, as we come up on a dead period, it's a name I'm really interested in, because he does fit that, experienced backcourt just presence that you need. Where, just run through the numbers here real fast: 13.4 points, 3.9 assists, and 3.9 rebounds on 35% from 3-point range at San Diego State this past season. So it's one of those things where, like with Lathan Sommerville, it's not like, hey, this is the guy who you expect to come in and just all of a sudden shoulder the load, right? Where I think if you pull in Quimari Peterson from East Tennessee State, that's a dude who can do that because of the way he shoots and everything. He's super impressive. But with Nick Boyd, you need more bodies. You just need more of those guys. And there are a whole bunch of names that are out there, and Washington, especially with this NIL budget, has been connected to all of them. It's been, hey, yeah, they're interested in this guy, that guy, that guy, that guy. Great. Okay. So as we start to narrow it down, and as we start to hear, hey, maybe this guy's coming on a visit, maybe that guy's coming on a visit, I think we might start hearing more about that next week, after this dead period. But I'm just really intrigued, because Boyd is a name where, yeah, you add that with JJ Mandequin, with Cortland Muldrew, and Zoom Diallo. Okay, now you're starting to see a foundation being set where, again, with Boyd being a senior, he will help some of these younger guys along as you continue to just build this roster out and see what it can be like. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank all of you for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming at you from spring practice, from the transfer portal, all of it. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel for new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you don't miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review. It does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Friday.